Hi, Rochelle.
Hi, Rochelle.
Hi, Rochelle.
Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Lisa.
Hey.
Okay.
Hi, Anita. Everybody.
Hi. Hi, Candy.
Oh, hello, Rochelle. Welcome, Rochelle.
Hello there, Rabbi.
Great to see you. Send regards to Larry.
Certainly will.
Yeah. Okay. All right, everyone. Let's get rolling over here. I'm confused. Where are we?
Mount, are those birds from your backyard? What?
Yeah.
It's nice. Nice. Great to hear
Nice.
that. I'm sorry. Apologize to them. I'm going to mute them now.
That's okay. We continue listening, right?
Cheaters. Yeah, you cheaters. Yeah. Okay. All right, everyone. So we'll say L'chaim here. L'chaim, everyone, to an inspired blessed Shabbos. This is a big Shabbos in the Chabad community, which I can say in our community. L'chaim. It's a big Shabbos because this Shabbos is the 12th day of Tammuz, which is the birthday of the previous Lubavitch Rebbe. It is also the day that he, after being released from prison 10 days prior, from a death sentence, was put into his sentence was lowered to 10 years of harsh environment of exile, and then 10 days later he was released and sent from the country. So essentially his life was entirely saved, and so it was a redemption. That's what makes this Shabbos a very special Shabbos. And that's the reason why, in fact, this is so significant that we don't say Tachnun, which actually on most Hasidic holidays we do say Tachnun, especially in Chabad. But for the 12th and 13th of Tammuz, we don't. So that would be Shabbos and Sunday. We do not say Tachnun. So I want to speak to you about living a life of courage. Living a life of courage. What does that look like? Are we doing it? Do we even have is it even required of us to live a life of courage? We live in thank God we live in a comfortable country that's accepting and embracing of us. What courage is required? We do our thing. So the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, who is referred to as the Frierdiker, which in Yiddish means the previous Rebbe, he accepted the leadership of Chabad when he was, I believe he was 40 years old, right after his father passed away in 1920. That was a really, really lousy, would be a major understatement for saying that would be a terrible time to be leading a Jewish movement in Russia. Communism was taking over completely. The worst enemy of one of the worst enemies, if not the worst enemy of communism, were the Jews, who were being severely, severely oppressed. So it was basically like it wasn't much different than what Israel did in 1967, or I should say what God did in Israel in 1967, where you had, one tank against 50, one plane against 250, like the numbers were, the odds are just, what are you even trying to do? The Frierdiker Rebbe called in 9 Hasidim, and he told them that I would like all of you to commit to devoting yourselves entirely to the furtherance of Yiddishkeit until the very last drop of blood that you have within you. And if each of you are willing to do that, I will do the same to form a minyan. And in this way, we are going to fight, even though we're fighting against a Goliath, we are going to fight to our last drop. That's what we're going to do. We call this in Hebrew, Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice. We are putting our entire being on the line in order to continue Judaism in Russia, underground essentially. And these 9 Hasidim, I guess the Frierdiker Rebbe knew his crowd. All of these 9 said yes, that they will. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, of course, committed to as well. 8, I believe, 8 of the 10, if we're including the Frierdiker Rebbe, or 8 of the 9, we'll say, ended up being killed by the Russian authorities. Only one was not killed, who was actually Rabbi Jacobson's, Rabbi Simon Jacobson, Rabbi Yossi Jacobson's grandfather, actually survived. And the Frierdiker Rebbe survived. Just so happens that's the way Hashem arranged things. But the other ones, in fact, gave up their last drop in order to preserve Judaism. And the previous Rebbe did it quite openly, to the point that they arrested him and were going to kill him. But through a major international intervention, he was ultimately released. What the previous Rebbe demonstrated in this is something unbelievable, and this is something that I'm trying to awaken within myself and within all of us. He realized there's natural fear. The previous Rebbe describes his imprisonment in very graphic terms. And when I say graphic, what I mean is he describes his feelings almost minute by minute during certain parts of his imprisonment, of exactly how he was feeling. And when his emotions changed, and the fear that grips a person. Now, the Frierdiker Rebbe was an astoundingly developed individual, which is what makes Rebbes who they are, astoundingly developed. And he describes yet the fear that he felt when he first got into the prison that overtook him naturally, and then how he had to recompose himself when he had a moment to sit down on a bench that he found at the end of a hallway, when they had sent him from one place to another and there was no one there to disturb him, and he had just a couple of minutes to sit down for a moment. He was able to recompose himself and grab a hold of himself. Because that's what happens to all of us. We are gripped by a fear. And if we, now very often, what happens is we live out of that fear. And what that fear does is it keeps us small. That's what it does. It keeps us in line, if you will, in the wrong line, but it keeps us in line, in the wrong line. And when we can get out of the fear or walk into the fear, however you want to describe it, but it's really, I think more accurately, it's walking into the fear and saying that, yes, I have this fear, but I can do things while I'm in fear. In other words, fear doesn't have to stop me. I can be in fear and I can still do. And the Frierdiker Rebbe essentially demonstrated to his Hasidim that I am greater than the communist regime. That's essentially what he was telling us Hasidim. We are greater than the communist regime, which in practical terms was a ridiculous notion. It was a ridiculous notion. It was like utter nonsense. What are you talking about? They're killing Jews every single day, arresting Jews all the time. 8 of them got killed, right? 8 out of the 10 got killed. The 2 didn't get killed, so they didn't get killed. But what is this idea that we are greater than the communist regime, so we're going to continue Yiddishkeit? They should have just thrown in the towel and say it's over. We'll try and find a way to get out of here, and that's it. No, we're going to try and make sure that as many Jews as possible will be reconnected to Yiddishkeit underground. Here's the fascinating thing. It was a completely ridiculous approach to take, and it was filled with odds which were stacked 100,000 against 1. And in fact, 8 of the 10 were killed. And yet, the fascinating thing is that here we are today, fully aware of the fact that Chabad is, and everything the Frierdiker Rebbe stood for, is the largest Jewish movement in the world, and communism in Russia is gone. That's the reality, because the Frierdiker Rebbe was correct. He was greater than the communist regime. And you are greater than the communist regime, and I am greater than the communist regime, unless our fear keeps us small. That is why this day is such an unbelievably powerful day. So what does that mean to us today in 2020? Well, the word Mesiras Nefesh can mean self-sacrifice, which was the case in 1920, But exactly 100 years later, interestingly, 100 years later, Mesiras Nefesh also means not self-sacrifice, but sacrifice yourself. Sacrifice yourself so that I live a life which is not about self. It's not self-sacrifice where I give up my life. It's self-sacrifice where I give up my life for the life or for God's life. That means I give up my self-desires. I give up my self-will. I sacrifice my dream home because if I live in another neighborhood, I can live the life that is expected of me. That I give up my favorite food because I am eating the foods that God wants me to eat, or the foods that nourish my soul, not just my body. I give up the time I want to spend for my enjoyment to spend it for someone else's enjoyment or for someone else's benefit. That is sacrificing self as opposed to self-sacrifice. As the Rebbe shares with us in the Hayom Yom, that the Hasidim of the Alter Rebbe said that they heard this quote from the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe said, "What is forbidden is forbidden." In case you didn't know, what is forbidden is forbidden, and what is permitted is unnecessary. Just because the cookies are in the cupboard doesn't mean you need to eat them. Right? I'm sorry for ruining your midnight snack tonight, but that's the point. Just because it's permitted, just because you're permitted to say it, doesn't mean you have to say it. And the Hasidim who heard this, they said that for the next 3 or 4 years, we labored with this. Okay, these were people who worked on their character very heavily. And until we integrated this manner of service into the various aspects of our lives. And only then did we permit ourselves to actually enter into a private audience with the Alter Rebbe, having at least developed ourselves somewhat. Have you spent 3 or 4 years working on making sure that what is permitted, in the fiber of your being is unnecessary? I haven't. I've given thought to it a few times, but committing 3 or 4 years, that's unbelievable. That is sacrificing ourself. So the Frierdiker Rebbe was released from Russia in 1927. 1929, he took a trip to Israel, and he spent most of his time in Jerusalem, Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, in Eretz Yisrael. And on Saturday, on Motzei Tisha B'Av, the evening post Tisha B'Av, so whatever day Tisha B'Av was that year, let's say it was a Wednesday, so Wednesday night, the Frierdiker Rebbe had a Farbrengen in the Chabad Yeshiva, which still exists in Jerusalem today, called Torah Emes, with the Bachrim, the yeshiva students there. And he spent 4 hours talking with them. And here's one of the things that he shared with them. He's 2 years after the horrific experiences, the terrible torture he went through when he was in Russia, which he suffered from the rest of his life, physically suffered from the rest of his life. So he said that, he said, Bachrim, yeshiva boys, I want you to know something. In Russia right now, there are 10 and 11-year-old boys who attend illegal chadarim, illegal cheders, where they learn Torah every day. And the KGB do make their best effort to track them down. And they do. They catch 10 and 11-year-old boys. And you know what they do? They grab these little kids, these little boys, and they bring them into prison. And they torture them. And they tell the kids, tell us the names of your teachers. That's what they tell 10 and 11-year-old kids. Tell us the names of your teachers. And you know what the kids would say? I have no clue what you're talking about. I don't know what school you're talking about. I don't know what teacher you're talking about. There's no teacher. And they would torture them some more and say, tell us the names of your teachers and we will stop torturing you and we will let you go. And the boys said, I have no idea what you're talking about. They would not dare give the name of a fellow Jew to the authorities to be arrested and most likely killed after being tortured. 10 and 11-year-old boys. That is Mesiras Nefesh. And he told the boys in Toras Emes in Jerusalem, what is your Mesiras Nefesh? Your Mesiras Nefesh is that when you have things which are hindering you from Torah study, that you face them and you work through them and you overcome them. That is someone who is living life with courage. That when things get in our way, we pay attention to them. We don't back down. We don't let our emotions win the day. But we speak to ourselves and we say, I am greater than this. And we work through it. And even though we're in fear, with the fear, we do what we have to do. This is what the Frierdiker Rebbe was teaching these yeshiva students from 10 and 11-year-old boys in Russia. It's the courage to take on life instead of submitting to life. And how do we know? I'll give you this challenge. How do we know if we are self-aware? If I know what's going on in my life? I'm not sure if I shared this with you or not. Razel, my daughter Razel asked me, this was a couple of months ago, I think. So her seminary in Israel shut down, of course. They all went home internationally, but most of the girls were from America. So they had on Thursday night, they have these Farbrengens. So on Zoom, so you can get anyone to Farbreng, right? You don't need to be in Tzvas. So she asked me one night if I can do that with her seminary. So I did. And what I spoke to them about was self-awareness, being aware of what's going on inside of you. How do you know if you're self-aware or not? One of the ways of knowing is simply if you can answer a question. So if someone, in other words, certain questions. So if I'm going to ask you, what is holding you back from doing something that your deeper self really wants to do, but some type of a concern? It could be financial. That means your money is holding you is keeping you imprisoned. It could be a fear keeping you imprisoned. It can be how someone thinks about you, that if I do this, people or someone will think some way about me. And that's why I am not doing what I want to do, what I believe is right to do. Now, my question now to you is identify one thing. If you can't, you're not so self-aware. And by the way, if you know you're not self-aware, that itself is being more self-aware. You're at least self-aware that you're not self-aware. And that's very, very valuable. Because until you can admit that, forget it. And then you say, I got to think about this question, and think about it for a week or for 2 weeks or 3 weeks until you have an answer. Because there should be about 10 or 20 or 30 answers to that question. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said this as well. The Frierdiker Rebbe said, I'm trying to remember where he said this. It was either in a letter that he wrote, I think, later on in 1933. He said that when someone is imprisoned, and I believe this is true, regardless of where you're imprisoned, a Russian prison is, it's no walk in the park, as they say. No prison is a walk in the park. But a prison in Russia then especially was a torture chamber. A prison in America is quite different than in Russia. But I would say that what he says about a prison remains true wherever someone goes to prison. As I've shared many times, I visited many prisons. Visited. I visited many prisons, all levels. And that's because the Rebbe, by the way, cared about prisoners. That's why, as a yeshiva student, I visited many prisons to visit Jewish prisoners. So the Friedrich Rebbe writes that imprisonment is in and of itself torture, because you're taking a human being who's an independent person, who has a life of his own, who has thoughts of his own, who has desires of his own, and the person cannot do what he wants. He can't be himself. That's imprisonment. So the Friedrich Rebbe, and in describing his imprisonment, the Friedrich Rebbe is describing this. And he says, now, and I've actually spoken about this a number of times also, because I felt this also when I walked into prison. This is exactly what I felt, actually. It gave me a very clear graphic metaphor for my neshama. And we all need to see this. This is what the Friedrich Rebbe writes. Imagine your neshama. It's imprisoned in your body. It's imprisoned in your fears. It's imprisoned in the way you think about money. It's imprisoned in how you feel that you need to be accepted by a certain person. All of these things, that imprisons us. And the only way a person gets out of this imprisonment is if we choose to live a courageous life. That means that we say, one second, I really want this. I'm not going to my grave without this being done. And I'll remind you what you've heard probably 20 times, right? That what is the number one thing people say on their deathbed? I wish I lived the life, I forgot the exact terminology, but I wish I lived the life that is true to me. That's essentially the greatest regret. And the reason why that's the greatest regret is because we let everything else control us and we don't muster the courage. And Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz remind us and encourage us and inspire us that as individuals, as Jews, who are endowed by Hashem with a divine soul, there is nothing that can stop us. The only enemy is the enemy that lies within. There's a great psychologist and spiritualist who says, I don't know where he got this statistic from, so I wonder if it's just a speculation, but he says that 85% of people live below the level of courage. I don't know if that number is accurate or not. I'm not sure how we can come up with an accurate number, but I think that's actually an optimistic number. And the question is, are we going to be from the small percentage of people who live with a level of courage? To really ask ourselves, what is it that I truly believe? You know, sometimes I've experienced this. I continue to experience this all the time. Sometimes I don't even know what I want because I'm so consumed in what I need to want because of my fears of other things. Does that make sense? So I want to say Alachaim in honor of Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz, that we should be inspired by the previous Rebbe, who had such fierce determination and fierce courage to make sure his neshama is not held in captivity. And ultimately, he did overcome. And may we all overcome. And we also have him backing us in his leading the path, setting the path for us, and us stepping into his footsteps. L'chaim, l'chaim. So thank you for being here, everyone. And you're officially unmuted.
Yasher Koach, thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Thanks for joining. Great to see you as always.
Thank you. Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. Good
Shabbos,
Shabbos.
everyone.
Good Shabbos to everyone.
Yes. Shabbos, everyone.
Good Shabbos from the Gershmans.
Good Shabbos, Gershmans.